Good morning, Morai Barabotai, Beruchim Abayim. We're continuing on Masechet Succah. We're on Daf Tetvav, Amud Aleph, and the Mishnah on the bottom of the Amud, 8 lines up from the bottom of the page. Today's Amud is being learned as a Zchut Refuah Shelema for Esther Bracha Bat Chaya, that should have full recovery, Be'ezrat Hashem. Also for Nisim Ben Miriam, that should have Refuah Shelema. And for Rachel Simcha Bat Nahid, that should have a full recovery. Refuah Shelema, Be'ezrat Hashem. Amen. This week's learning of the community has been graciously dedicated by the Shea family, by Dayan family, by Kohen family. Should be an ultimate zchut for all their mishpachot, Be'ezrat Hashem. Amen. Okay, so our Mishnah is going to speak about the continuing basically on what you could use for schach and what you cannot use for schach. And here we're going to be talking about those items that are mekabel tum'ah, furthering our discussion of the previous Mishnah. And the Mishnah says, Hamekares sukato b'shpudin, if you use metal beams for your sukkah, that would be, of course, mekabel tum'ah. Metal beams are going to be shpud, is used for food items, and for other, depending on what type of shpud it is a kli matechet, and it's going to be considered mekabel tum'ah. So if you put hamekares sukato b'shpudin, if you use these on top of your sukkah, now the Pnei Yehoshua over here says, why not mesachech? The normal verbiage would be mesachech sukato. You use it as a schach. Mekareh, it's the language of korah. Korah is a beam. Beam usually is something that holds something else up. But really this opens the discussion. We're going to have a little tangent to that, but mainly it's going to be discussed later, of using an item that's mekabel tum'ah in order to hold up my schach. Not that it itself is the schach, but it's like the korah, it's the beam that's holding up the schach, which again will segue into much needed and relevant discussion of having metal beams as the structure of my sukkah, which nowadays many people do have them, and laying the schach down on those, and we'll get to that discussion as the sugya unfolds. Says the Mishnah, if you do that, or b'aruchot hamita, or with the side beams of a bed. So imagine if you have a bed that has 4 poles, and then you have wood going in between, and the length, and also in the width, the 2 ends of the bed. That basically will be a skeleton of a bed. You have the 4 poles and wood beams going, attaching those poles together, making a frame for your bed. So imagine if I broke that frame and put one side of it on top of my sukkah, that would be aruchot hamita. So if I use shpudin or aruchot hamita, im yesh revach berein kemotan kshera. If you have enough space between the shpudin, enough that is the same width as the width of the shpudin. Imagine if every shpud is 2 inches. So you have 2 inches of the shpud laying there, and then 2 inches open, another shpud 2 inches, another open 2 inches, and then you fill in the open parts with schach kasher. And shockingly, the Mishnah says, that is kasherah. Now, of course, the Gemara is going to ask the obvious question, that here you don't have schach kasher, the majority of the schach. It's going to be 50-50. Who says 50-50 is mutar? Right? You have 50% schach pasul over here, right? So Gemara is going to deal with that. And then lastly, the Gemara says, hachotet begadish lasot lo sukkah en sukkah. Right? If you have a pile of hay, massive pile of hay, and Sukkot is approaching, so you have your kids dig inside. Like, go dig. Our kids used to do this in East Coast with snow. Like, when we had like a snowstorm, and you had this massive piles of snow, especially when they cleared off the roads, and then they would add everything on one corner, you had like 5-6 foot tall piles of snow, and the kids would make a house inside of it, digging in. Right? So you could do that with also a gadish. You could also make that with a pile of hay. So you say, well, it should be kasher because the walls, doesn't matter what they're made out of. The schach has to be from gidulo min karka. There's a hay, last I checked, it's gidulo min karka, it's detached. It's not mekabel tuma. Check. We should be fine, right? No, this is the classic case of pasul midoraita. Why? Because ta'aseh v'lo min asui. Why? Because imagine the gadish, the pile there. When you carve inside of this, you have not touched the top. You created the schach by doing something to the bottom. The schach was never laid up there for schach. This is different than the machloket rishonim. You remember we spoke about this before, that it's nowadays even a machloket poskim, whether or not you could make the schach of your sukkah first, or you have to have the walls first. You remember that? We spoke about this, right? Because it's much more convenient for people to be able to pass the ladder and go around when there is no walls. So you put the structure up, the walls are not there, whether you're using the canvas walls or whatever else you have. So you're passing through, going around, putting the schach, laying down the schach, and then you put the walls, right? You should not be doing that. You have to put the schach at the end, we mentioned. And many would say that this schach is pasul, right? But some of the Rishonim, from the Sugya of Istaba, earlier on Daf Dalit, they prove that Meikar Hadin is kasher. Because there, we're talking about the case that schach, you made the schach, you laid the schach down as a schach, but there was a problem. The problem was, the schach was too high. It was 20 amot plus. Right? And then you make an istaba on the bottom. Now you raise thereby the platform of the sukkah, and now from that platform to the ceiling is less than 20 amot. Kasher. You remember that? So this is much worse than that. Because there at least you put this, you laid down the schach as a schach. You did it. It was higher, so the eye doesn't catch it, whatever one of the 3 or 4 reasons in the beginning, daf bet and daf gimel. But over here, you never made a schach. It just happened to be created by the means of you touching something else, and now this is schach. And therefore, says the Mishnah, hachotet begadish, if you do that, eina sukkah. If you want to create a sukkah, eina sukkah is a language deoraita. That this is garnish given, as they say in Farsi. It's nothing, right? It's not considered a thing. Fine. So says the Gemara. This that you say 50-50 would be, the case of shapudin, that you put space in between them, like the space of the shpudin itself is kasher. So he was telling me 50-50 is kasher. That should be a kasha on Rav Huna bered Rav Yehoshua, the Itmar. This is a Gemara in Masechet Eruvin, Daf Tetvav, speaking about not schach of sukkah, but walls of a mechitza that you are creating, in regards to Eruvin, right? But there also you have to have parutz less than omid. That means you have to have more wall, standing wall than holes and open areas in the middle. So says the Gemara over there, in the name of Rav Huna bered Rav Yehoshua, parutz keomid. What do you do if you have mamash 50-50? Rav Huna bered Rav Yehoshua says, it's a disagreement in the Gemara there. Rav Papa amar mutar, Rav Huna bered Rav Yehoshua amar asur. Why? Rav Papa says it's mutar because you have to have parutz merube al haomid to be pasul. In order for it to be invalid, you have to have more open than closed. Here you don't have more open than closed. And therefore, 50-50 says Rav Papa is kasher. Rav Huna bered Rav Yehoshua says no. In order for it to be a walled area, you have to have more wall than open. And here you don't have more wall than open. So 50-50, pasul. So the Gemara says, let us apply this to schach as well. You mean, in order to have schach, you need more kasher than pasul. It's the same idea. So I don't mind borrowing the concept from Masechet Eruvin to Sukkah because it's really the same concept. If you want to have a kosher schach, you have to have more than 50%. Just like you have to have more than 50% a wall when you need a wall. So says the Gemara, says no, not necessarily. Because Rav Huna, the son of Rabbi Yusha, could say, "My kemotan benichnas veyotze." You know what the Mishnah says when it says it's kasher your schach when you have the same space as the shpudin? It means you have to have enough space that you could put a shpud in, right? Whenever you could fit something in, obviously the area that fits in the thing is a little bit, tiny bit wider than the thing itself. If you have exactly the same space, it's not going to fit. So if I have shpudin arranged and then I take every other one out, the space that's there, well, I may call it kemotan, but it is, if you really exactly measure it, it's going to be slightly wider than the shpudin itself. So when you fill in that area with schach kasher, you're going to have more kasher than pasul. That's what it means. Benichnas veyotze, says the Gemara. So the Gemara says, well, v'ha'efshar lesamsem. If the Mishnah says kemotan, I could be very exact. I could be very exact and say it's exactly 1 inch, each one of them, to the T. So when it says kemotan, Mishnah should mean exactly like that. And the Gemara answers, according to Rashi's understanding, Amar Rav Ami, b'madif. It says, no, it's not exact. It's talking about like kemotan. That means you had it there, you peeled it off, you took it off, and now the space is slightly wider. The Tosafot do not like the Perush of Rashi because it's like a redundancy in the Gemara. And they say, b'madif means, no, the space is exactly the same. If every shpud is exactly 1 inch, the space is exactly 1 inch. Ma'adif means I'm putting over it. I'm putting a ton of schach kasher, and much of it is also going on top of the schach pasul, so it's batel. It gets mixed together. You remember we had this concept before when we spoke about a vine that's attached to the ground and you cut it and then you fill in a lot of schach kasher on top, or you don't cut it and you fill in a lot of schach kasher on top. At some point there is a concept of bitul that it gets nullified, the schach pasul to the schach kasher, given that they are mixed. Right? You remember that? And we had another case of the branch of the tree that you lower it and mix it with the schach kasher, then you go after the majority. So this is that case according to Tosafot. But really, even according to Rashi, the next step of the Gemara is going to be exactly that. Says the Gemara, Rava says, no. Even if you're exactly the same, afilu tema beshe'en ma'adif, even if the space is not anymore. So every piece of metal that you have there is 1 inch. Every open area that you have next to it is exactly 1 inch. Or 4 tfachim, 4, whatever you want to say. Says the Gemara, Im hayu netunim sheti noten erev noten shti. You know how this works? If you have the metal beams going across the length of the sukkah, right? The orach, which would be shti, right? Shti means across the orach, erev means across the width, right? So shti ve'erev. So it says if the metal beams are going across the length, then the schach kasher is going across the width. Now, if I have these two going, north-south, and I'm putting east-west, in order for the east-west to sit on top of this, it has to be slightly wider than the space in between these two poles, right? So these two going north-south, and east-west is sitting on top, so it has to be a little wider. And therefore, part of the area that is covered on the bottom with the shpudim, on top is covered with Schach kasher. So if you look on top of the sukkah, what do you have more? Schach kasher or schach pasul? Absolutely schach kasher. Right? Because for every 2 poles that are schach pasul, the schach kasher is sitting on top of it and is covering part of that in order to be sitting on top. Right? Is held with the schach pasul, hence it's overlapping. And overlap, if you have 50% air and 50% schach pasul, when you cover the air with overlap on top of schach pasul, you end up with more schach kasher. That's pashut. So therefore, overall, all in all, you'll have more schach kasher, and that, says Rava, is the case. Fine. Now let's examine this second one. This is going to be very fun, and it's going to be very important as well. So the second case of the Mishnah was, you did it with the shpudin, with these metal pieces, or be'aruchot hamita, right? With the side boards of a bed. Now the Gemara says, well, side boards of a bed, if you broke the bed's frame, you're telling me that even if I break it to pieces, the sideboard still is going to be mekabel tum'ah, and it's a problem, right? That's what you're saying. So says the Gemara, let's examine this. Lema mesayale the Rav Ami bar Yomi. The Amar Rav Ami bar Yomi. Let us bring a proof from our Mishnah to the Shita of one of the Amoraim called Rav Ami bar Yomi, who says Sichecha beblae kelim psula. Right? I'm not sure if I mentioned this before or not, but whenever the Gemara says psula, is a darabanan. Whenever the Gemara says Eina Sukkah, is the oraita. Not just we just had by Achotet Begadish, Eina Sukkah. That's the oraita level. When it says psula, is a darabanan level. So Rav Ami bar Yomi said, if you take blae kelim, like you have garments that they have basically rotten away, they've been so used that now they are completely torn to pieces that are smaller than the minimum amount of halachic definition for a cloth. What is the minimum amount of the halachic definition for cloth? Is 3 by 3 etzbaot, right? Which is 6 centimeters. Pretty small, right? It's like less than 2.5 inches. Right, slightly less than 2.5 inches. That is your 3 esbaot, right? 3 esbaot by 3 esbaot is your minimum amount of usable cloth. So that's the halachic shear for mekabel tum'ah. Anything less than that is not mekabel tum'ah, because what is it? It's nothing, right? It's not a cloth. It's not usable cloth. Even an ani cannot use something that's smaller than that, right? So says the Gemara, if it was reduced to pieces smaller than that, well, it should lose its status of tum'ah. So it's no longer mekabel tum'ah. Can I use it for schach? So Rabbi Ami says, no, you cannot. Why? Because midrabanan, we make a gezerah that if we open this gate of letting cloth being used for schach, oy vavoy, vaveila. People are going to be putting go to downtown, one of the shmata Persian guys, and put the whole thing shmata on top, and that's it. So who's arev? No one is going to guarantee that. So therefore, gezerah derabanan. That's Rav Ami bar Yomi. You with me? So what happened over here? You had a cloth. It was reduced to a minimum shiur minus. So it's less than a minimum shiur. It's the same exact thing as I had a bed frame. I broke it to pieces. Now I have a bedside. Right? I have a little side beam, side board of a bed. Right? If it was on its own, it would be pshutek li'etz. And pshutek li'etz are not mekabel tumah. This is coming from a kli, but it's reduced to something that's not a kli anymore, right? So let us bring a proof. Rav Ami bar Yomi is an Amora. Let us bring a proof from a Mishnah to Rav Ami bar Yomi. Our Mishnah is saying exactly the same thing as Rav Ami bar Yomi is saying. He's talking about cloth. We're talking about a different kli, but it's the same thing, right? Sounds very, very professional. Something not necessarily. Kedamar Rab Chanan Amar Rebbe Ba'aruchav Shtikra'ayim says no, we're not talking about a sideboard of a bed alone, just a little pshutekli et. We're talking about a sideboard with the two legs that's attached to it. Every sideboard is attached to two legs, right? So we're talking about the sideboard with the two poles, the two legs, bed legs, that are attached. That's what we're talking about, not as a regular side. Maybe a regular sideboard, if it gets broken and reduced to that, maybe it will be completely okay for Sukkah. Here we're not talking about that. We're talking about a sideboard that comes with the two legs, right? Let's read this and we'll explain it more. Barucha ushte kera'ayim b'ksara ushte kera'ayim. Either the sideboard in the length, which is arucha ushte kera'ayim, or sideboard with the bed head and foot, which is the shorter width part of the bed, which will be ksara ushte kera'ayim. But both of them come with two legs attached. That's what we're talking about. That, in other words, that's why it is pasul. So our Mishnah is not a proof necessarily for Rabbi Yomi, who's talking about a cloth that was reduced to nothing, basically. That is further bigger chumrah to say that is pasul for schach of sukkah. Fine. Now, says the Gemara, Hecha itmar Rab Chanan amar Rebbe. Where is this case? You're telling me we're talking about a case of tum'ah by a bedpost of Rab Chanan bar Amar Rebbe. Where is that case? Right? So says the Gemara, Ahad itnan. This is said on a Mishnah Masechet Kelim, Perek Yudchet, Mishnah Tet. There the Mishnayot are discussing what happens when you have a kli that becomes tameh. How do you take it out of the tum'ah? Now, we know that if you completely break a kli, completely break a kli, so then it loses its status, right? But you have a bed. The bed became tameh. Now, I want to take the tum'ah off of this kli, right? When does it become reduced to a status that the tum'ah could be dealt with in an easier way? So says the Mishnah, mita mitamet chavila umitaheret chavila. Divrei Rabbi Eliezer. Machloket Tanaim. Rabbi Eliezer holds a bed, even if you take it apart, still becomes tameh. Right? Still becomes tameh. Mitamet chavila umitaheret chavila. Take a look at Rashi. In the first line, im teme'ahi en tevila ola la evarim ela metakena umatbila. You have to have it together to dip it in the mikveh. For the tum'ah to go away, you can't just take it to pieces and then take every piece to tevila, right? Can't do that. So says the Gemara, that's chavila, beyachad. Mitamet chavila, it only becomes tameh like that, umitaheret chavila. It also has to be together for it to become tahor. The Chachamim say no. Mitamet evarim umitaheret evarim. It could become tameh when it's taken apart, but it also could become tahor when it's taken apart. So therefore, if you have a massive bed, California king, and you want to dip it to the mikveh, well, you're going to have like a Belze shul in Yerushalayim. You have to find that their mikveh. Right? What are you going to do? So you could open it and make it tahor piece by piece. Now, what is piece by piece? Can I have every little piece of wood? Says the Gemara, my nihu, what is that? Amar Rab Chanan Amar Rebbe, arucha ushte kera'ayim ksara ushte kera'ayim. We're talking about not that you mamash, like dismantled every single thing. We're talking about you open the frame, but you have the sideboard with the two legs. That's how we're talking about. That's when it becomes tameh, when it's it's mekabel tum'ah when it's taken to pieces, and also it could become tahor according to the shita of Chachamim. So says the Gemara, wait a second. In order for that to be correct, you have to have an explanation of why that is different than pshutei kliyes. In other words, you're telling me that, if you open it to mamash pshutei kliyes, you dismantle the entire thing, then it's not mekabel tum'ah. But if you have arucha u'shtei kara'im, if you have the sideboard with 2 legs, then it's mekabel tum'ah. Why? Well, in order for it to be mekabel tum'ah, it should be considered some sort of a kli. And a kli means that it could be serving a purpose by itself. What purpose does it serve when you have only arucha u'shtei kara'im? So says the Gemara, Lemay chazia, what is it good for? Lemismechinu aguda ulmetav alayhu. Says you don't need 2 sides. You could have the wall as one side, hook this up on the wall, and then put a mattress on top and sleep on it or sit on it. And that would be good. So says the Gemara, Ulmishtashli, you could also put strings in between and make it like a real bed. So but the Eved, if push comes to shove, this could be serving as a bed by itself without the other piece. Therefore it's mekabel tumah. That's what the Gemara says. Kufa. We learned. Amar Rav Ami bar Yomi. We learned this just right now. Rav Ami bar Yomi said, "Sichicha bebelai kelim psula." That if you use, completely reduced pieces of cloth that have been warping away, and now they're smaller than 3 by 3. It's about, says the Gemara, my belai kelim. This that you say is pasul. What is belai kelim? Amar Abaye, matlaniot she'en bahem 3 al 3 etzbaot. So we had jumped the gun to explain this to the Chevra here, but the Gemara now explains. It says, what is the minimum amount? It has to be at least 3 al 3 etzbaot in order to be mekabel tumah. If it's reduced to less than 3 by 3, that's when he's talking about belai kelim. That they're not even usable for anim. And the ani uses everything, right? Even a small cloth you could use for something. But even an ani has its limits, right? When it's something small, it's like a 2-inch little something, that's not usable even for an ani. So therefore, it becomes no longer mekabel tumah. Tanak Mated Rav Ami bar Yomi. We learned in a Braita, like Rav Ami bar Yomi, machatzelet shel shifa veshel gemi, shiarea af al pi shenifchatu mikashiur, en mesachechin bahen. Rav Ami bar Yomi's yesod, his fundamental principle is, if something is mekabel tumah, which this belai kelim used to be a kli, used to be a garment. A garment is mekabel tumah. Now you reduced it to less than 3 etzbaot. Still, b'darabanan, we're not going to allow it. Right? That's his principle. So it says, the Gemara says, we find a Braita that supports that principle. What is the Braita? If you have a mat, right? A mat that's made for sleeping on it. Usually, in the time of Chazal, even in the Far East, even right now, the mats, a lot of them are made for sitting on, sleeping on. So if you have a mat like that, and now it was reduced to a minimalist thing that you can't even use it, the Braita says it still is pasul for making a schach out of it. Even though that's not mekabel tumah anymore now, but it's coming from a mat that was made for sleeping on, for sitting on, and therefore we're not going to allow it. That supports, of course, the very principle, concept of Rab Abi bar Yomi. Says the Gemara, machatzelet shel shifa veshel gemi. If you have one of these mats, shiarea, its leftovers, afal pi shenifchatu mikishiura, even though that they are now reduced to a smaller shiur than mekabel tumah, in misachechim bahen. Midarabanan, you still cannot use them as a schach. So says the Gemara, just to finish this up, machaselet hakanim gedola misachim bahen, ktanayim misachim bahen. The Gemara goes on a tangent talking about mats. Gemara says the big mats you can use for schach. The small mats you can't use. Why? Because you know why they would make a big mat? For schach. When you make a mat, you could be the kavanah, the person that makes it, makes all the difference. If you make a mat that's made for people sleeping on, which is usually small ones, then it's pasul. Midoraita is pasul. It's mekabel tumah. But if you make a big mat that's made for schach, for ceiling material, then it's kasher. So the Gemara says the big ones, kasher. The small ones, pasul. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, af hi mekabel tumah. Rabbi Eliezer says even the big ones are mekabel tumah. Why? Because it's machloket tanaim. What's the kavanah of the person that makes them? Rabbi Eliezer says, who told you that the big ones people make for schach? People make big ones, maybe the whole mishpacha is going to sleep on it. Like go on a picnic. So even the big ones are pasul, says Rabbi Eliezer. Ve'ein mesachkim. So that becomes actually a topic for nowadays as well, because the bamboo mats that are sold in the non-Jewish stores usually are made nowadays not for sleeping on, not for sitting on. They're made for walls or for schach. So both of those would be kasher. So in lieu of any other problems, they would be actually kasher for schach if you don't have other mekabel tum'ah issues that we have discussed, and we will also discuss further. Imrat Hashem will continue the next topic in the day to come. Zaku Baruch.